Hi there. I am Melissa, a C-suite executive who has turned everything that she's learned over 20 years inside of businesses and is teaching all of you how to thrive in your 9 to 5. I'm so happy to have all of you here. And this week, we are going to be talking about the difference between overachievers and high performers. This has been something that I have struggled with professionally for a really long time. And as I moved into people management, I started to see that there was a distinct difference between the two. Now, before we get into all of that, I have to preface all of this by saying it's Friday around here. I usually don't record on Fridays because by now my brain is fried. Absolutely fried. It's Friday of 4th of July week, so I honestly don't even know what day of the week it is anymore. And yesterday, Meta brought Threads into the world. So if any of you are out there on social, you know that Threads is a thing. And it has given me so much energy in life because it's just so fun and freeing and silly and all the things that it got my creative juices flowing. And I thought, heck, why not? Let's record this episode right now while it's fresh in my brain and I have a bunch of energy to talk to you about it. Coincidentally, this topic has been something I've been kicking around and taking notes about for a while. And then this morning, I'm an Orange Theory enthusiast and a running enthusiast. So I can't do both simultaneously. So I kind of rotate. And I tend to find myself inside of Orange Theory on a pretty regular basis, like going to the mattresses. Literally trying to outdo myself, one-up myself. I'm super competitive, not so much with the people on either side of me, but just with my own physical abilities. And as I got about 2/3 of the way through the class and I was looking at my stats because they're up on a big screen. If you haven't ever been to one of those classes, you wear a heart rate monitor and for the whole entire world, it tells how hard you're working. And I paused and said, you're trying to kill yourself. You're very clearly attempting to do the impossible today. You are overachieving. You're no longer living in the land of a high performer, of somebody that's competitive with themselves and wants to knock it out of the park, but not at the sacrifice of their well-being or, quite honestly, how their body's going to perform over the next few days. And I started having an argument with myself, basically saying, you need to slow it down. You need to dial it back. This is not one of those moments in time where you just need to work for the sake of working. And it's really that easy to go from somebody that sets goals and is competitive with themselves and is performing at a really high level to one that's overachieving. And when I walked out of the gym, like super red-faced and probably needed to drink 3 gallons of water at the end of that, what kept resonating in my mind was how easy it is to switch just unconsciously. There's some sort of external factor at play or your subconscious takes over. And the next thing that you know, you've stopped showing up in the way that you want to as the high performer, and you start showing up in a way similar, yet incredibly different as an overachiever. And I sat in the car after I got home, kind of wanting somebody to carry me into the house. And I thought, this is the exact analogy for what overachievement feels like. When you're performing at a high level, it's invigorating. It's exhausting too sometimes. And at the same time, you have this renewable source of energy that keeps propelling you to go forward because you're enjoying the process so very much. When you're overachieving, you're goal focused. Today, I was focused on getting to the end of class. I was focused on running as hard as I possibly could for 2 or 3 minutes. I was focused on a very specific result that I wanted, and it was all out, workhorse, work as hard as I could. I tipped the scales from enjoying the process that I was in and trying hard into whatever it takes. I'm going to lay it all out there. I'm going to get there. And we do this professionally so very often, making that context switch without even realizing it. And then we start to have conversations around burnout and being unsatisfied in our job or having a career that's stalled and not understanding how to get promoted or a raise or move forward and what should we do. And often it comes from some internal switch that was made and we stopped being one sort of person and having one sort of approach and taking another. So in this week's conversation, we're going to be talking all about overachievement versus high performance. And we're going to first just define, what does that look like? What is the difference between overachieving and high performing? And then we're going to talk about how you can determine which camp you sit in. Maybe you don't. So if you're not living in a season where you're living in either one of these, this is still a really good conversation for you to participate in, because it's going to help you identify the symptoms when you enter that season again. So we're going to talk about the differences between overachiever and high performer. We're going to talk about why they're different and the traits associated with that, how you can tell which one you are. And then we're going to talk about how these two different categories of workers are viewed in the corporate world. So when you show up as an overachiever or a high achiever, what does that look like? What does that represent? And what consequences or benefits does it hold for you as an employee? And we're going to wrap all of that up with a couple of tips that I have for you if you want to switch from one to the other. So let's just dive right in. And as all of you know by now, because you've listened to a bunch of episodes with me here, my favorite thing to do when I want to dissect language is I went to the dictionary. I went right to Merriam-Webster and I said, can you please tell me what overachievement means? Can you please tell me what high performance means? Please tell me what these things are. And interestingly enough, as I am starting to find a trend with the dictionary, the terms that have more of a negative connotation attached to them have many more descriptions of what they are, whereas the ones that are the positive, they're pretty succinct because it takes less to convince people that that's what they mean. So when we're talking about overachievement, what that is where you are really trying to achieve more than is standard or usual. And people that are overachievers are often characterized as hard-driven workaholics. So if you've ever called yourself a workaholic, raise your hand. Yes, that's me. For those of you that can't see the video that's going to be up on YouTube, I am raising my hand. For those of you that have ever been called a workaholic or called yourself a workaholic, you are living in the land of overachievement. Overachievers have high expectations of themselves and of other people. So they take the expectations that they have set for themselves and they absolutely transfer them over to others, whether that's the right thing to do or not. And this can be a slippery slope in people leadership, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And also, overachievers hold themselves to an impossibly high standard, one that can never be obtained, one that is just impossible, absolutely impossible to arrive at. Now, if we're talking about a high performer, some of these things could sound the same. Because a high performer also achieves more than is expected. They achieve more than the standard. High performers tend to, over time, do more and perform, deliver better quality results, are more efficient, work faster than the standard employee. They're performing in a way that's delivering value at a greater speed, quantity than others. So they're labeled a high performer. They can also set very high standards, but only for themselves. The difference between a high performer and an overachiever in this instance is that high performers set standards for themselves and expectations for themselves. They don't pass them on to others. They're really telling themselves that this is what I expect of you and this is what you need to be working towards. So it's subtle, but it's different. And the other thing that I want to call out is that a high performer is never categorized as a workaholic. And I'm going to be able to tell you in a few minutes how you know which one you are. And it's really, really clear why one is called a workaholic and the other is not. So the signs of an overachiever, if you're now wondering, I don't know. I kind of sound like an overachiever. I kind of sound like a high performer. I'm not sure which one I am. Well, here's a little checklist for you to run through and see where you fall. So overachievers, first and foremost, only care about the outcome. So if we go back to the story with me in the gym today, my first chapter of overachievement there was I was on that stinking treadmill for about 25 minutes and I was going to hit 3 miles. That was just going to happen. It didn't matter what they were asking me to do. It did not matter that there were intervals where I was sprinting and where I was walking. It didn't matter that I was running up hills and running down hills. It did not matter. The goal, as soon as my feet hit the treadmill that was not moving, was 3 miles or bust, by any means necessary. And that meant that I didn't care how I got there. That meant that I did not care that I was overexerting myself. That meant that I did not care that by the time I got off of that thing at 25 minutes and 3.05 miles, because I did get the goal or the result that I was looking for, that I would be exhausted and almost to the point where I didn't know I was going to finish the rest of the class. That's an overachiever. The high performer would have kicked her own ass on the treadmill and then also happily skipped to the rest of the class without feeling like she was dying. That's the difference. An overachiever is also known as a perfectionist. Anybody ever called you that? I know that I have been called a perfectionist many and many times. And the irony is that my human design is a manifesting generator, which means that I literally run around with half-baked ideas and stuff that never gets completed. I'm the opposite of a perfectionist, like the absolute, hands down opposite of a perfectionist. Another characteristic of an overachiever is that they criticize themselves. They're highly critical of every single thing that they do, no matter how good, no matter how big the value, no matter how fast they got something done or how efficient they were. They're always critical of the result. It's never good enough. And this translates to others. So as we talked about, overachievers set high expectations for themselves and they translate those to other people. And that criticism translates as well. Remember, when we talk about people management in a minute, how this comes into play, because that one is really important. Overachievers also work just too much. Somebody that's an overachiever may be working 70, 80, 90 hours a week and producing as much as somebody that works 40 hours. Because part of an overachiever's DNA is that they have to keep the machine going. They have to get the grind going. They have to go, keep putting the energy and attention into it because that's how they're going to get to the result. It's very skewed thinking. There's a lot of science and research around how that's flawed. An overachiever's mind, though, is wired to continuing to work, continuing to burn the candle at both ends, continuing to go, because that's the way that they believe that they're going to get the result that they want. Exactly like me on the treadmill today. I didn't stop running. I should have taken a break. I absolutely should have slowed down, but I didn't because I needed to get to those 3 miles. And directly on the heels of that, the final thought around an overachiever is that they are constantly reaching for the finish line. They're like that sprinter in the race that's literally laying out their entire body trying to cross the line before the person on either side of them. They're solely focused on what's happening in the future. As soon as they cross that finish line, they're already looking at the next race and the next finish line, and that's where they're focused. They don't stop for a minute and say, oh, we did it. Let's take a breath. No, they're constantly focused on the future and what's next and where they're going to put all of their energy and their time and their effort because they're always focusing on results. And when one result is achieved, then they go on to the next result and they try to figure out how that result itself is going to get achieved. Overachievers expend a lot of energy. They put in a lot of their heart and soul and just effort into getting the results that they so desire, in making things perfect, in exceeding their own expectations. There's a lot of weight that sits on a person who's an overachiever. Now, if we switch lanes for a second and we talk about high performance and who a high performer is and what that looks like, it's really, really different. A high performer is worried about the quality of their performance. They're worried about how well they're working towards the end result. They're worried about how efficient they are. They spend most of their time thinking about how they're going to get there, where the overachiever thinks about just getting there. And they seek clarity. So a high performer wants to be crystal clear on what needs to happen, what the potential risks are, who needs to be involved, what their manager's expectations of them are. They're constantly seeking clarity, even throughout the entire process. They're willing to accept imperfection as long as they understand the bigger picture. They also are known for working smarter, not harder. So whereas the overachiever is known for being a workaholic, high performers are known for working smarter, not harder. That's a huge difference. Huge difference. The overachiever is going to be working the 70, 80, 90-hour weeks. The high performer is going to get the same results, if not better, working 30 or 40 hours a week. The high performers focus on making things better. So how they achieve the result also needs to include doing it better than it was done before. How can we improve a process? How can we become more efficient? How can we do this for less money? They're always looking for a benefit. They're always looking for how they can make something better while they're going through the process of getting to the result that's been defined. They also take breaks. So this is the difference, again, between the overachiever and the high performer. The overachiever will just go. The overachiever is me on the treadmill saying I have to get to 3 miles by any means necessary. The high performer is I'm going to push myself really, really hard. And then when they tell me to take a break, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a break. And maybe I get to the 3 miles. Maybe I get to 2.95. That's close enough. It's close enough. Because taking the break and recovering, significantly more important than having a perfect result that I had set for myself. The other thing with high performers is that they're rewarded with opportunities. Overachievers are given assignments. High performers are rewarded with opportunities, and generally they're given the ability to select the opportunity they want to take. Overachievers are given work. They're delegated to. They are piled on top of because they're the workhorse. Whereas the high performer is cared for, is nurtured, is given stretch goals and assignments because management has a belief that based on who they are and how they work, they can handle the additional responsibility, taking all of their intrinsic capabilities of taking breaks and seeking clarity and making things better as they go and still getting the results that they're looking for. The other thing about a high performer is nothing that they do is based in fear. They're just not afraid. Where the overachiever is always looking over their shoulder and they think somebody's out to get them, and if they mess up at all, it's going to be doomsday. The high performer isn't worried about that. They understand that accepting risk and failure is a part of the play. They understand that this is how you grow. They understand that this is what it takes to become a better performer in the long run. So now that we've explained the difference between an overachiever and a high performer, I know what you're all saying. Well, I want to be a high performer. I don't want to be an overachiever. That sounds awful. It sounds miserable. Where I am an overachiever right now, make it stop. How do I make it stop? Well, I'm going to give you some tips for that in a few minutes. First thing I want to say is I have been, I will be, and I continue to be both. It depends on the day of the week. It depends on what is going on. It depends on what habits I slide back into when I'm stressed. The very early part of my career, all you could label me as was an overachiever. As a student in college, overachiever. Carried way too many units, worked a full-time job, was in a sorority, had a massive social life. Overachiever. Everything needed to be perfect. Was focused on all of the results. Was going to graduate in 4 years, come hell or high water. Did it. Overachiever. That translated to my professional career. And I was an overachiever inside of my professional career for a very long time. And you know what my wake-up call was? It wasn't me having kids. It wasn't me getting some critical feedback. It wasn't me missing opportunities. It was me sitting inside of my first ever calibration session for employees and understanding how corporations force rank their staff. And it was in that moment that I realized how much I had stifled my career because I thought overachievement was the way to get there. As soon as I realized it had nothing to do with that and that high performance was the key, I set my sights on completely switching my mode of operation, completely switching my behavior, completely switching my narrative. It was hard. I was rewiring what was probably 30 years, if not more than that, of behavior. I had identified that there was an intrinsic difference between being an overachiever and a high performer, and that there were significant benefits to be a high performer. And then I had to figure out how to reverse all of those habits I have. You know, we talk often, and I heard this on a podcast on a completely unrelated topic this morning. We talk often that it takes 10,000 hours to be an expert at anything. Think about how many rounds of 10,000 hours I had in 30 years learning how to be an expert overachiever. Just think about that for a second. 30 years. How many hours are sitting in 30 years? How many rounds of 10,000 did I go through becoming an expert overachiever to have a realization that that, in fact, was not how I was going to be successful, and I needed to change everything? So did I flip a switch? Did I have this awareness? Did I make the moves and magically I was a high performer and I'd given up my overachieving ways? Heck no. You can't just stop being an expert 10, 30, 40 times over and change your way of doing things the next day. It was hard. I had to have internal conversations and battles with myself. I had to do things like force myself to leave my laptop at work. I had to do all sorts of crazy things to begin my novice journey of high performance. And then I had to say, it's going to take me 10,000 hours to get this right. And by the time I hit that first 10,000 hours, I still didn't have it right, because some of those hours I backslid back into overachievement. So maybe the 10,000 hours was really only 5,000 hours. And so I had to keep doing those cycles over and over and over again. Now that I'm, 15 years in to this round of 10,000 hours of investing myself and becoming an expert high performer, it comes more naturally. Do I still backslide like I did this morning? Yep. Do I still backslide professionally sometimes? Yep. However, I know what the symptoms are. And for me, the very first one, and this is why we're going to talk about people management now, is that I start having unreasonable expectations of other people. That's when I know that I have moved the needle and I have gone from high performer to overachiever. I can see it clear as a bell. It's my biggest wake-up call that I have. Because the thing is that both high performers and overachievers will be rewarded with people management opportunities. Because from the outside perspective, unless somebody's really diagnosing your performance and your behavior, overachievement and high performing can look very similar. So often, the first to get people management opportunities are people that fall into these two camps, where the high performer is going to care for and nurture and train and really feed into their teams and their organizations. The overachiever is going to set unreasonable expectations. They're going to have a really short fuse. They're going to be taking their perfectionist natures and putting it on everybody else. They're the boss that you've had that is always at work and expects you to always be at work too. It's the boss that you've had that calls you on a Saturday and tells you to stop what you're doing. It's the boss that you've had that tells you you have to work on your vacation. That's what it's like working for an overachieving manager. And as soon as I realized that there was a difference between overachievement and high performance, I developed a hit list so that if I started doing these things, I would know that I had swung the pendulum in the wrong direction and I needed to course correct. As soon as I set expectations that I knew were unreasonable, as soon as I was demanding things to be perfect, as soon as I was working longer hours and expecting other people to work longer hours, as soon as I was getting irritated that people weren't responding to my emails fast enough, as soon as I was thinking about calling or texting somebody when they weren't in the office, I knew that I had swung the wrong direction. Once you see that you're an overachiever, you can't unsee it. So then it becomes a matter of having enough awareness and enough wherewithal to put checks and balances into place so that you can course correct yourself. Because if you're like me and you're just standing here today and you're like, oh my, I am an overachiever. Oh my, I fall into that camp. What do I do? Well, friends, you're on day one of a 10,000 hour journey of your first round of being an expert as a high performer. Give yourself grace. You're going to backslide a whole heck of a lot. I just got done telling you that for 30 years, I became an expert at being an overachiever. And for the last 15, I've been trying to be an expert at high performance. To level the playing field, I got another 15 years to go. Awareness is your secret weapon. This is where it comes into play. So now I told you that where I got this awareness from wasn't from feedback. It wasn't from me reading a book or listening to a podcast or having a friend point something out or a family member or any of the other people that knew that I was an overachiever and that I really needed to make these changes. No. It came from my very first round of employee calibration when I was a new people manager. And I had heard the word calibration before. I had Googled it because I wanted to know what it meant. I understood what the definition was, but I kind of wanted to understand in corporate structures what it was. And the thing is, you can't really find out how it happens. And what I'm here to tell you is it is incredibly subjective. It's probably the most subjective thing I think I've ever seen in business, candidly, which is frustrating and also means it's out of your control. And I was new, so I didn't know how this works. So I was an observer the first time. Somebody else had made the assessment of the team that I had inherited, so I didn't have to do anything except just sit and kind of watch. And that was the best opportunity I had ever probably professionally been given, because I got to observe the process. I got to observe the politics. I got to observe what was successful and what wasn't. And I got a front row seat to how people were categorized in the corporate world. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and say that every single business does this differently. There are a lot of businesses out there that say they don't do this anymore. I'm telling you right now that they still do assessments of their employees. They may have just retired the term calibration. There is not a single business on the planet that doesn't periodically assess their employees across these dimensions. There just isn't, because it would be a fool's errand. It would be the disaster of the century. It would tank their company in the long run if they had a blind eye to the type of individuals and their working styles inside of their company. It would be a disaster if they didn't spend time doing this assessment. So whether they call it calibration, they call it something different, whether HR is involved or HR isn't, because now also there's a bit of contention about HR wanting to be there because they don't feel it's the right thing to do because it is so subjective and heavily laden with politics. It still happens. It may not happen in a big forum anymore. It may happen in a smaller forum. It still happens. I've talked to enough of my colleagues that are C-suite executives. I've talked to enough of all of you. I've talked to enough of HR professionals to know this is a standard business practice. So if what I'm about to share with you, after I share it, you think, that's not my company. We don't do things that way. We're a startup. We're new. Company's only been around for 5 years. Or we're super small. There's only 10 employees of us. We don't do that. I'm telling you right now, it happens. And it's in your best interest to assume that it does, because then it helps you determine how you want to show up. All right. So this was my experience. This was the old school way this was done. I am almost certain that a good chunk of the Fortune 100 and Fortune 500s are still doing it this way. And I am also certain that many, many companies have thrown this out with the bathwater. We did something that was called a 9-box exercise. And this 9-box exercise was really, really simple. And you talked around 2 dimensions. performance, and potential. So you could be an employee that was a high performer with low potential, or you could be an employee with low performance or high potential, or you could be somewhere along the spectrum. Now, the creme de la creme, the employee that everybody wanted to have, the unicorn that was in the room, was the high performer with the high potential. If you had one of those and everybody agreed, you were in a position of power. And you were also incredibly vulnerable because everybody wanted the person. Everybody. They want to neutralize you. You had a secret weapon and it was a bit dangerous. So that was the lay of the land. And literally what everybody came in with was they figured out where in this 9 box, so 3 boxes down, 3 across, 3 in the middle, right? Where every single employee went. And you literally put their name in a box. And depending on the level of sophistication of the exercise, you may actually not just stick them in a box. You might put them in, the middle box, but you're in the top right, which means you have a little bit more potential than the employee that you put in the middle box in the top, the bottom left, right? I mean, there was a lot of sophistication with some individuals with how this worked. And depending on who the leader was in HR that was facilitating it, it would get that granular. And then one by one, you had to defend your assessment publicly amongst your peers and maybe your peers' leaders, depending on how big the room was. So you had to show in some form or fashion where your employees went and why they were there and to give evidence. And then you had to get feedback from all corners of the room. You needed to accept the feedback. You needed to challenge the feedback. And the entire collective room by consensus had to agree where that person needed to be before you could move on to the next one. Sometimes 50% of it was really easy. Sometimes none of it was easy. There was always at least half that was near impossible. You would end up with 2 camps. And this is where the politics came in because it stopped, candidly, and that's what you get from me because I demystify all the things. It stopped being about the actual person and their performance and their potential. And I should pause here for a second and say, so the performance this is actually what you deliver. This is the value that you deliver, the service that you deliver, the output that you deliver. And the potential is learning agility. So do you have the potential to grow? Do you have the potential to learn more? Do you have a growth mindset? Can you take on more responsibility? Can you continue to evolve your career and go upward with us? If the answer is yes, then you go higher and higher up on the potential scale. If the answer is no, people that are resistant to change, they have low potential. People that will not go to training, low potential. That's how those 2 things play together. And so they're completely different dimensions. And I said that, you may not get the best performance rating if you're a low performer, but if you have high potential, you're going to get a lot of mentoring and coaching because they see that if you just tapped into that potential, this performance would go way, way up. So the politics would come in and it stopped being about the actual individual. It stopped being about the facts related to their performance. This is what they were asked to do. This is how they did it. This is how we measured the performance, aka goal setting with measurable outcomes. And it became the leaders and their relationships. And so you would see people kind of hunker down into camps. You would see these 2 leaders who worked really well together and they were loyal to each other and they probably met in advance because that happened. There's lots of pre-meetings that happened too. And they said, I'm going to defend your position. And then you had the other ones that maybe they were in a rough patch with that leader. Maybe they were working on a project together that wasn't going well and there was dissension. Maybe they had 2 employees that were having a conflict, which meant they were having a conflict. Heck, maybe those 2 leaders didn't like each other because let's be very clear, we're all human. So maybe they were not each other's cup of tea. And they would start butting heads. And then the calibration, the assessment of the human didn't have anything at all to do with that human's performance or potential. It had everything to do with who was going to win the debate. Now, I was in these sessions where we had great senior leadership, and the senior leader stepped in and cut through the bullshit and said, this person performs really well, has, moderate potential. We're leaving them where they're at. Let's keep moving. I was also in sessions where these things went on for days and we didn't have a good leader and they let everybody duke it out. And the problem with the duking it out approach is that word spreads eventually. The results of these things are supposed to be confidential, and inevitably they come back to the floor. Inevitably, you find out which box you landed in. Inevitably, you find out who was fighting against you and who was fighting for you. It just happens. I've never seen one of these be completely confidential. And then you as the human get a little bit frustrated. Like, why was that leader out to get me? Why didn't they stand up for me? I thought we had a good relationship, and it just creates a disaster. But this is the reality of the situation. So the reason that I'm sharing with you how this works is because A, don't let it rattle you. It's a point in time assessment based on who's in a position of power when, and that power can shift almost immediately. But B, knowing where you fall is incredibly important, because the perception of your performance and your potential is tied directly to your job security and growth potential. So when these conversations happen in a peer-to-peer format supervised by a leader or HR, you need to seek out the feedback from your manager. You need to follow up with your manager after and say, you don't need to ask them what the words are. Am I high potential and medium performance? Am I a low performer with high potential? You don't need to ask them those things, but you do need to say, as an outcome of those conversations, what feedback is there so I can take action on it? And your manager, when you ask them the right questions, will be able to tell you, you're performing really, really well. We notice that you struggle with change. And in order to advance your career, in order to get that promotion, in order to get that raise, in order to get that project, you need to get more comfortable with change. You need to demonstrate a growth mindset. You need to show us that you're out there acquiring industry-leading skills and techniques, whatever that is. So it's an opportunity for you to understand how you're perceived. And it's also an opportunity for you to get an inside view into, am I an overachiever, am I a high performer, or am I neither? Am I in that murky middle? Well, nobody argued with my placement because nobody really knows what I'm doing. Understanding that you're in the murky middle is just as important as knowing you're on the extremes. I share all of this with you because the ones that get the opportunities, the ones that get the doors kicked open for them, the ones that get more airtime and visibility and all of those things, they're the high performers. They're the people with potential. They're not the overachievers. The overachievers generally in those sessions are most criticized for biting off more than they can chew, for being abrasive, for having unreasonable expectations. Likely, there's been complaints from other business partners and colleagues that they're difficult to work with. So understanding how that works and where you fall into it gives you clues on how you're perceived, because getting advancement in your career has everything to do with the perception of others of you and something to do with your performance. Let me say that again. Advancing your career has everything to do with others' perception of you and a little bit to do with your performance. It's the reality. And there are these structures inside of corporations that clearly define how that assessment happens. And often it happens without you knowing. And then you don't get the feedback. And then you have an inability to course correct. So understanding what overachievement looks like, understanding what high performance looks like, and then understanding how companies subjectively assess how you fall on the spectrum allows you to have data and facts that puts you in those camps, and then you get to see what that perception is so that you can make a decision around how to influence the perception. If you are seen as difficult to work with because you're an overachiever, that's a perception of others on you. So then you say, well, I don't want that to be that way. So what do I need to change? Well, I'm setting unreasonable expectations. So that's the very first thing I need to change. You have to do some work and dig in, but understanding how corporations assess this, how teams assess this, and then understanding your role and gathering that information and then tailoring how you do your job, not what you do, how you do it, is the key to professional success. It's really, really that simple. So in the end, this perception, this reality, if you're an overachiever or a high performer, impacts everything. It impacts the assignments that you get. It impacts the career opportunities that you receive. It impacts how big or small your network is. It impacts whether or not you have a mentor. It impacts your visibility. It can impact everything. Not to mention that high performers have a good quality of life. They take breaks. They go on vacation. They have pursuits outside of the office. Overachievers typically work as life. There's a trade-off there. And some seasons of being an overachiever are required. Sometimes you've got to push really hard and grind really hard. You need to be cognizant of and aware of the choice that you make and the trade-off that you have. As a recovering overachiever, as a recovering workaholic, as somebody that still struggles sometimes because she's got many more hours of being an expert as an overachiever than she does as a high performer, this was the pivotal moment for me. This is when my career trajectory changed. When I flipped that switch and I realized I needed to let go of one way of working to introduce a new way of working, I became a new person. I showed up as a different employee. I showed up as a different people manager. I showed up as a different human in all aspects of my life. Was it easy? No. Was it hard? Yes. Was it worth it? Hell yes. I have dropped a ton of information in here today for you around the difference of overachievement and high performance, why it should matter to you, and how you can identify which camp you fall into. I've also talked to you about how corporations use this information to make decisions about you and your career, your income, your opportunity. Take this information and share it with the people in your life. We all know somebody that falls on either side of the spectrum and can use this information to help them make their next pivot and move. So my ask of you today is to think about who is in your network and then text them this episode and invite them to take a listen and let them know that you are thinking of them. I thank you so much for your time today and for joining me in this conversation about overachievement and high performance. Until we meet again, friends, I just want you to know that you are wise and you are strong and you are capable, and I believe in you.